Hello there and welcome back to Sultan Sanctuary. Today we're wearing the Assassin set, which is pretty much an anime ninja set. And to go along with it, we're wielding a giant rusted ladle. Cause ninjas used spoons, right? This here is one of the better Reaper class weapons because it has especially high damage, a lot of that being in the base damage, which means buffs are better on this since their damage is based purely on the weapon's base damage, and does not factor in any scaling based off of stats. It also upgrades with that beast line of upgrade materials, beast fangs, hateful jawbones, twisted hearts, etc. Sadly, we can only bring it up to +4 at the moment, but even with it being a bit less upgraded than our previous weapons, it's still pretty damn good. So we're venturing back through Kran's Pass here in order to enter into the Ruin Temple. This is far and away the most convenient entrance since it is so close by a sanctuary. Apparently people were having trouble with Ronan Kran here given all the graves around. Seems a bit odd to me, I've never found them all that difficult. But in addition to this being one of the more convenient entrances, it also ends up leading to a side area that you cannot get to if you take one of the other two entrances. So this is definitely the best way to enter this place, since that way you can pick up the few extra items that are over here. And of course, whatever you happen to get from the enemies here. This, by the way, is probably the best area in the game to farm the Split Swordsman, if you want the ear or the upgrade materials they can drop, the Lord's Orders, and very rarely the King's Orders. So one thing I'm just gonna say about the Ruin Temple straight off is that as far as areas go, this is definitely one of the least interesting ones. Especially in the back half of the game here, where pretty much each of the areas has its own sort of unique gimmick to it. This one doesn't really have anything other than being a gauntlet of enemies and having the occasional traps to trick you, such as plenty of boulder traps. Be sure to be on the watch out for tripwires. It does admittedly have this pretty cool new enemy type called a Thing of Arms, a rather apt name that, and a fairly dangerous medium-sized enemy type. They attack quickly, have a ranged attack where they pick off one of their arms and throw it at you, and even have a command grab which you do not want to get caught by. It's one of the more damaging command grabs at this stage of the game. Though certainly not the most dangerous, I should note, the Drowned Porcelains for example, or one that we have yet to see, and is the bane of many a player that we'll be seeing next time. So, coming over this way to fight some more hanged men, let's actually talk about something fun, such as how this game actually uses its concept of a whole bunch of areas mushed together quite well, and it's clear that they actually put a lot of effort into that, rather than purely using it as a justification for slamming multiple level types together. This bit right here, for example, greatly resembles Hager's Cavern, and we're coming to a bit here that greatly resembles the Red Hall of Cages, and in fact leads back to it. It actually feels like the different areas are bleeding into one another rather than being strictly cordoned off by themselves and just sort of being fit together neatly like puzzle pieces. And I just think that's really cool. So yeah, this ends up leading back to the Red Hall of Cages in another completely useless shortcut. And sadly, the conciliatory item they give you isn't all that great either. The Shroud Ring merely gives you a modest buff to Holy Defense, which isn't a damage type that comes up often. Would have been useful against Murdiella Mal, but anywhere else, Well, we do pick up some other more worthwhile items on the way, such as that Amber Idol, which could be useful if we want to do more transmutation in the future. But otherwise, it just ends up taking us back around to the Ruin Temple here. So, if nothing else, the Ruin Temple here is good for giving you a lot of varied upgrade materials. Gives you a whole ton for the basic line of upgrade materials, Soldier's Poems, Lord's Orders, and even a King's Order, which are quite rare indeed, as well as a few transmutation items such as that Amber Idol, and as we'll be seeing later, a free Diamond Cluster, one of the few ways to obtain that item without joining the Order of Splendor. And since we're quite close to the end of the game, you're likely to have plenty of gold and salt with which to upgrade items. So if you haven't been doing much transmutation up to this point, now's a pretty good chance to start. But as nice as it is, being able to find a whole bunch of upgrade materials here doesn't really save this area from the fact that it's just kinda boring. Visually, it's not that interesting, and its gimmick is pretty much just ambushing you with enemies, which is something that we've seen before. Granted, there are a few situations where you can use its traps to your own advantage. This boulder trap, for example, can be used to take out the 2 split swordsmen that we fought without having to fight at all, and you can avoid taking damage from it yourself as well if you manage to get up on that platform in time. Most of the time, at any rate, the hitbox of the boulder is a little bit fiddly, and sometimes it can even hit you when you're up there. I did intend to actually, show that off, but I kind of forgot when I was recording, so whoops, sorry. While we're on the subject of things that I intend to do but ultimately forgot to actually show off here, Reapers, they actually got patched in a recent patch that went up. So their previous issue of being unable to do a proper riposte after parrying enemies is now rectified. I guess that wasn't actually a purposeful design decision, or if it was, the developers changed their mind after people were negative enough about it. So now you can actually parry with them, thus striking away the one major weakness of the Reaper weapon class, which is pretty nice to hear. So this is yet another useless shortcut with some conciliatory items pathway. There were just so many of these things that I really can't help but wonder if the levels were actually just designed in a vacuum, and then just slotted together towards the end of development in a manner that just kind of mostly worked, which is why you end up having a lot of these dead-end shortcuts that you never really end up using. Well, at least this one gave us some pretty nice items, namely the guide set. So if you want your character to cosplay as Indiana Jones, you can do that. Granted, you can only do that very late into the game, but it's something, right? So, coming back this way, we're ultimately coming to the third and final entrance into the Ruined Temple. This being the first one that we saw that was past the Bloodless Prince. So yeah, that means everything in this episode up till now has basically been backtracking of a sort. We've made no real progression even if we did go through new areas. Well, as I've said many a time by now, we did pick up some nice items, so it wasn't completely for naught. But it just goes to show you how much of the content in this game can be skipped if you just don't want to do it and you're in the know. Discounting glitches that allow you to beat the game in under 40 minutes, you could probably end up having an average playthrough be around 5-ish hours if you knew what you were doing. And that's very much a good thing, I would say, considering this is, after all, a Metroidvania. And to me, one of the core qualities of any Metroidvania is sequence breaks. Now that I think about it, given this game's heavy emphasis on combat as well as exploration, it actually ends up benefiting a bit more from having sequence breaks more so than other, less combat-focused Metroidvanias. Since a big part of the game is what you use to deal with the various enemies, skipping certain areas will limit what you're able to use at certain points of the game, and thus how you end up dealing with those enemies. For example, if you take a path through the game that results in you having all of your good weapons be striking damage, and then you come up against one of the bosses that heavily resists that, you'll likely have a tougher time on that playthrough than your previous one. Actually, leading into another topic, so the balance in this game, as I've discussed before, isn't exactly the best. Big, heavy weapon builds are far and away superior to any others. If you're using a great sword, a great hammer, a great axe, you're going to have a much easier time than if you're an agile dagger user, for example, or even if you just stick to swords or axes or things like that. But by far and away one of the biggest balance issues is the 2 damage types, slashing and bludgeoning. Namely that of the 2, enemies, especially bosses, are far more likely to heavily resist bludgeoning than slashing. And I don't think this was a matter of circumstance either. I think this was a very deliberate design choice, keeping in mind the fact that big heavy weapons are far and away way stronger than any of the other weapon types, and the fact that big heavy weapons tend to be blunt. A lot of the great swords do blunt damage, and great hammers, of course, do purely blunt damage. So basically, what I think likely happened is that they only realized that big heavy weapons were just far and away better than the smaller, quicker ones, at a late stage in development, a point at which making major balance changes would be quite difficult indeed. So they attempted to quickly patch that by simply making a lot of enemies resist striking damage. However, big heavy weapons are not the only weapons that do striking damage, and that results in the smaller, less good already weapons that do striking damage just being even shittier. And keeping that in mind, it makes two of the developer-provided challenges that you can select at the beginning of character creation especially cruel, namely the Ore Only and Iron Part Only challenge runs, where those are the only weapons you can use, and they are weapons that do purely blunt damage. Anyway, all that aside, we finally come to a sanctuary, which is a rather odd placement for one, given the fact that it's honestly not that useful. We're only a few steps away from the boss, so it might as well have just been a shrine, although the fact that it is a sanctuary does let us place stone idols to get a few bonuses. So let's get some more gold and item find here. It's already a good location for farming after all, so why not make it even easier? Over here we have a very brief sneak preview at a new zone. And by very brief I mean the title card plays, but we can't actually access any of the area. This is technically part of it, but if we were to drop below further into the rest of it, we would die. There is no way to survive that. It is, however, a very nice shot, so let's just disable the HUD for a few seconds here. That could almost be an album cover or something. Oh yeah, there's also the fact that the HUD by default comes with these weird trim things which act as a sort of border. It's an interesting stylistic choice, but one that I'm not a huge fan of, so I tend to leave them off. But I figured I'd turn them on here just to show them off, since I don't believe I've ever done that before. So I mentioned before that we were only a few steps away from the boss, and I very much meant that. This sanctuary is right outside of the boss room, and we can actually see part of the boss kind of right here. That little wispy thing in the upper left. We'll have to actually venture onward to see what it is. So that wispy thing is a ghost, and it is not the boss. The boss here is this giant axe. The ghosts are simply its wielders, and as ghosts want to be, are completely incorporeal and cannot be harmed. You must attack the axe itself. That doesn't mean that the ghosts are harmless, however. Even when they're not wielding the axe, they will throw magic projectiles at you, and that's honestly the more dangerous part of the fight. The axe attacks are slow and heavily telegraphed, and thus are very easy to avoid. But the projectiles are quick, and you can't always see them coming at you in advance, because sometimes the ghosts like to fly off screen, so you just have to always keep track of them if you want to know where the projectiles are coming from. Add to that the fact that the projectiles do a surprising amount of damage, especially later on into the fight, and later on that they really like to spam them, and more likely than not you will end up dying to the projectiles more so than the axe. So overall, this isn't the most difficult fight in the world. In fact, it's a pretty easy one, I would say, because much like the Bloodless Prince actually, even if you do get hit by their attacks, they're not damaging enough to be especially worth worrying about. Especially any attacks dealt by the axe, as they tend to knock you around, which gives you invincibility frames, so you can't get stun-locked to death. That would be the magic's domain, which is another reason why it's far and away the bigger threat in the fight. But while it's certainly not a difficult fight, it can be a tricky one to manage depending on what the two ghosts do, especially later on in the fight when they prefer to just spam magic at you rather than actually wield the coveted axe. If, for example, they decide to go to either end of the arena and both start spamming magic, you basically don't have anywhere you can roll to and you end up getting stun-locked to death. Kind of like what happened here. Only kind of, because there was definitely room for escape, but I wasn't competent enough to manage it. On the other side of the coin, if you can manage the two ghosts' placement well, you can end up taking out the coveted in record time, because they'll just be spamming their magic uselessly off in a direction that you're not in. Once they start throwing magic in a direction, they can't change it. And then you can just wail on the Coveted for free damage. And that's something I actually succeed in doing in this attempt of the fight, at least early on. Also, for some reason, the salt did not go into the Coveted itself, probably because it was one of the two ghosts that killed me. And you can't actually hurt them, so that would make this fight uniquely difficult in retrieving your salt from. So that's all there is about the fight that's actually worth mentioning, but before I take a brief break from commentating until the end of the fight that is, I do want to mention the lore about this Coveted axe here. Namely the fact that it was a magical axe that was so coveted by a father and son royal pair that they ended up killing each other over it and ended up becoming permanently bound to it to act as its guardians. It's just a pretty cool concept. But yeah, see you in like 40 seconds. So yeah, that's the Coveted fight. Much like the area it's in, it's not all that remarkable. It's a pretty unique gimmick at least, unlike the area itself, but still not all that exciting of a fight, you know, despite me dying to it once. But that's more due to a moment of incompetence, more so than the fight itself actually being difficult. Thankfully, we're finally coming to the end of the Ruined Temple here. It is not a double area with two bosses, I can thankfully say. And we actually get a bit of an additional reward for completing it. At least if we've been diligent about following a certain masterless swordsman, as this is the next location that he shows up in. He doesn't really have anything all that interesting to say here, no more tips about what might lie ahead because he has no idea himself. Just a bit of background detail on himself, such as the fact that he's been questing since he was 13 years old. So he's pretty much a Bethesda protagonist if you think about it. You know, specifically slaying brigands and scoundrels, exploring uncharted caves, that's kind of Bethesda game protagonist to a T now, isn't it? Given this game's heavy Dark Souls inspirations, it's obvious that they were trying to go for a sort of Siegmeyer sort of character, but they kind of didn't manage it. Really, a large part of Siegmeyer's character is his wonderful voice acting, which isn't really present here since it's all text. Coming over this way, one exit out of the Ruined Temple leads over to the Pitchwoods, the area that the Masterless Knight mentioned, and the area we'll be exploring next time. And additionally, an area that shows off that having a unique gimmick in terms of level design isn't necessarily the best thing. Bland and boring being more palatable than novel but poorly executed, that sort of thing. But before we end things off, we have one final NPC to talk to, someone that we've not seen for a long time. Last time we heard from this old salt-soaked man was outside of the Castle of Storms when he told us to return to the start. Here he ends up revealing the commonality between everyone who ends up washing upon these shores. The fact that they are all the betrayed, people who are sent on quests on false pretenses, such as the despondent thief who was sent to guard a noble that just turned out to be a slave. Or extending it a bit further, likely ourselves, who are sent to guard a princess who may also very well be a slave. The only way we'll ever know for sure, of course, is if we find her, and hey, wasn't that our initial goal all along? Then again, was that really our initial goal? After all, the sorcerer that we talked to wasn't entirely sure of what his own goal was, setting about on a voyage. Well, nevertheless, we have encountered Sanctuary, and in the end, isn't that all that really matters?